The revolutionary communists of America are excited to announce a new book by our comrade John Peterson titled Colossus, The Rise and Decline of U.S. Imperialism. It isn't enough to hate imperialism. In order to defeat it, we need to understand it. This book looks at the history of U.S. imperialism, and just like Lenin's book on the highest stage of capitalism, uses facts and figures to grasp the basic features of imperialism. Pre-order the book now in the description below.
Years ago, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the bourgeois said that the world was entering into a period of stability and prosperity, but the exact opposite has turned out to be the case. Looking at the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine, the shifting economic alliances in the Pacific, in Africa, in Latin America, the recent period has seen an increase in war and economic instability. Over the last year, hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. have participated in the largest pro-Palestine movement we've ever seen in this country, and the word and concept of imperialism has been very present in that movement. Many people here in the U.S. are beginning to understand the horribly reactionary role of U.S. imperialism, are correctly blaming U.S. imperialism for the devastation in Gaza, are considering themselves anti-imperialists, and want to do something to end imperialism. Everyone in this room wants to see the end of imperialism in our lifetime, and that is a very big task. And the first step to ending imperialism is to understand what it is. It's not a simple thing to understand, it's a complex topic, and to really understand it, each one of us is going to have to make a careful study of Marxist economics, of Lenin's writings on imperialism, on the history of the development of capitalism, and on the current relations between the imperialist powers. But it is absolutely essential that we do so, not just in order to understand the war in Gaza or the war in Ukraine, but really to understand capitalism as a whole in the modern era. So the basic Marxist understanding of imperialism was developed by Lenin and is laid out in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which you can get back there at the literature table, which he wrote in 1916. And in preparation for writing this book, Lenin carefully studied the development of the capitalist economy up to that point. He cites a huge number of facts and figures throughout the book, and he based his analysis of imperialism on this very concrete study of the facts, which is where all Marxist analysis should begin. And Lenin showed that imperialism is an economic phenomenon that develops inevitably due to the functioning of capitalism as a mode of production. There's not a single sentence or a perfect definition for what imperialism is. It is ultimately a stage of development of capitalism that has particular economic characteristics. It will look different in different countries, in different regions, and at different time periods. But Lenin does lay out some characteristics that generally describe the imperialist stage of capitalism. And so he ends up characterizing imperialism in this way, quote, "Imperialism is capitalism at that stage of development at which the dominance of monopolies and finance capital is established, in which the export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, in which the division of the world among the international trusts has begun, in which the division of all territories of the globe among the biggest capitalist powers has been completed." Now, this description is preceded by 6 chapters describing how this phenomenon developed, how the modern capitalist economy functions, and that is really essential to understand imperialism as a phenomenon. Capitalism as an economic system is based on the private ownership of the means of production. It's based on the generalized production of commodities, which are goods that are produced for sale on the market. And under capitalism, each individual capitalist needs to outcompete their competitors in order to survive. So they're forced to try to produce things as cheaply as possible in order to make the most profits and in order to sell their goods for cheaper while still making a profit. And eventually, this process means that certain capitalists will win this competition through gaining larger and larger shares of the market, putting their competitors out of business, or just buying their competitors outright. And production eventually becomes concentrated in the hands of a small handful of major companies. And this process is the starting point of Lenin's imperialism. He describes how the early stage of capitalism which was based on free market competition between producers, is transformed into monopoly capitalism, in which production is so concentrated that eventually a handful of major companies dominate each industry. And these monopolies employ the most advanced and efficient industrial techniques, and they have enormous workforces. And that was happening in Lenin's day, and of course that process has continued to develop to this day. Right now, there are over 35 million businesses in the US, but the Fortune 500, which are the 500 largest companies by revenue, account for 60% of the GDP. So that means that 0.001% of companies in the US produce 60% of all of the wealth produced in the US. And that same 0.001% of companies employ 17.5% of the American workforce. This concentration also happens across all types of industries. Basically, any major industry that you look at will be dominated by a handful of companies. Just a couple of examples: 2 companies control 69% of the office supply market. 10 auto parts suppliers control 60% of the auto parts market. 4 airline carriers own over 80% of the commercial air traffic market. A single railroad controls 47% of all grain and oilseed shipment. 2 companies control 75% of the candy market. 3 companies control 99% of the drugstore market. Amazon accounts for 39% of all e-commerce sales. And this is just from like a very quick Google search. But any industry that you look at will have very similar characteristics. And so the free competition that the defenders of capitalism claim to exist has, at this stage, turned into its opposite. And we now have an economy that is dominated by a handful of gigantic corporations. There have been, even in the past, attempts to break up these monopolies, but that is not a process that has been stopped. For example, in the 70s, there was the breaking up of the Bell Telephone Corporation into 39 baby bells, because it was the dominant monopoly in that industry. But over the last several decades, many of those companies have actually merged with each other, and now those 39 have merged into 7 companies. So you see the breaking up of monopolies and then the merging of those companies into again a small handful of dominant companies. So Lenin describes how, alongside this concentration of production and monopolization in industry, you see a similar process in the of concentration of capital and monopolization in the banking sector. And because of their role in the economy, as they grow, banks begin to have an enormous amount of economic control. They consolidate deposits from across entire nations, and this gives them access to a huge amount of money to invest and to loan. And as they give larger and larger loans and buy larger and larger shares of companies across many sectors of the economy, this eventually gives them the power to control industry to their benefit as well. And Lenin gives an example in Imperialism of a letter written by a German bank to a cement syndicate. So this is the letter that the bank wrote. As we learn from the notice you published in a certain newspaper, we must reckon with the possibility that the next general meeting of your syndicate, to be held on the 30th of this month, may decide on measures which are likely to affect changes in your enterprise which are unacceptable to us. We deeply regret that for those reasons we are obliged henceforth to withdraw the credit which we had hitherto been allowed to you. But if the said next general meeting does not decide upon measures which are unacceptable to us, and if we receive suitable guarantees on this matter for the future, we shall be quite willing to open negotiations with you and grant a new line of credit. So these institutions are able to control not just a single industry, but many industries at a time through loans, through owning shares in other companies. And Lenin terms this money capital that the banks have access to and use to dominate the economy as finance capital. Today, there are other institutions like hedge funds and asset managers that are not banks, but who play the same role. In the US today, there is an extreme concentration in the banking sector. There are 4,500 banks in the US, but the top 10 of those, so the top 0.2%, control over 50% of all commercial banking assets. And like I mentioned earlier, 4 companies, United, American, Delta, and Southwest, control 80% of all commercial air traffic. And then if you look at the owners of those 4 companies, just 5 finance capital firms, Vanguard, PrimeCap, BlackRock, Capital World Investors, and State Street, so those 5 finance capital firms own 37% of United, 29% of American, 27% of Delta, and 41% of Southwest. And this same handful of finance capital firms and banks, plus a couple of others, have their fingers in every single industry in this same way. So you have major corporations that dominate particular industries, and then on top of that, you have finance capitalists that own large shares of these major corporations across many different industries and can therefore exert an enormous amount of control over the economy as a whole. So the entire economy becomes a funnel of profits into the hands of a very small number of financial institutions. And in addition to that, Lenin describes how these financial institutions, these finance capitalists, become very entangled with the state, which acts to carry out the interests of the large capitalists in each country. So, for example, in the 1940s, the U.S. state helped to facilitate the construction of the State of Israel, and it continues to this day, of course, to send billions and billions of dollars of military aid to Israel. And it did so, and continues to do so, as a strategic decision on the part of the American capitalist class as a whole, ensuring that American companies can have access to materials and markets and trade and a favorable environment to do their business in the Middle East. So as these monopolies arise and become more and more efficient, they begin to saturate their local markets. They can't sell any more commodities locally. And this happens because under capitalism, the working class produces more value than it is paid in wages, which means that it will never be able to buy back all of the commodities that it produces. And this means that the capitalists need to look for new markets to sell to, and they begin to expand their sales to other areas of the country and eventually begin exporting these commodities into other countries. And this battle over markets is a key aspect of imperialism. Today, the top 100 multinational firms make 51% of their sales on foreign markets. This drive towards expansion is an inevitable feature under capitalism, and Lenin describes that alongside the drive to export commodities comes the drive to export capital. These monopolies and finance capitalists begin to amass an enormous amount of capital, which they need to then invest profitably and competitively, which means finding new and cheaper sources of raw materials, of labor and land. And so they begin to export not only these commodities, but also capital. They begin to build or invest in factories, in transport, in mines, in foreign countries where raw materials and labor are cheaper. So for example, on the US-Mexico border, there are thousands of maquiladoras, which are factories that are owned by American companies. They set up shop right across the border in order to have access to cheaper labor in Mexico, and then to be able to easily import the goods that are produced there to sell onto the American market. So through this drive for expansion and the process of the export of commodities and capital, the entire world eventually becomes entangled and pulled into the capitalist economy by force. Lenin describes that the world gets generally divided into imperialist countries and dominated countries, and that as capitalism develops globally, it develops unevenly as it spreads across the world. In the dominated countries, capitalism is imported with monopoly characteristics, and development is driven primarily around the extraction of raw materials, around the large-scale production of goods. And so you have incredibly advanced productive techniques alongside underdevelopment in other basic infrastructure. Now, when Lenin wrote about this domination was generally achieved through direct colonial rule. You had colonization occurring alongside the growth of monopolies and the export of commodities and capital in order to ensure access to raw materials, cheap labor, and new markets. And again, here you see the merging of the large capitalists and the state. This process was done by the state in order to carry out the interests of their capitalist class of having this access to markets and materials and labor. But after World War II, there was a wave of revolutions in the colonial world that overthrew this direct colonial rule in the vast majority of the world. And these revolutions brought political independence in the former colonies, but this political independence did not come with economic independence. And to this day, they remain dominated by imperialism in a new form through the indirect control of finance capital, which is now the main mechanism for the domination of the imperialists. The banks and the finance institutions suck enormous profits out of every corner of the globe and keep these dominated countries subjugated. Lenin, even in 1916, when he wrote Imperialism, saw the possibility of this happening. He wrote, quote, "Finance capital is such a great and such a decisive force in all economic and in all international relations that it is capable of subjecting to itself even states enjoying the fullest political independence." And this is exactly the case today in the majority of Africa, parts of Asia, and Latin America. This control is maintained through a variety of mechanisms, through massive loans, which have very high interest rates and basically political and economic strings attached to them, through predatory trade agreements that allow the imperialist nations to trade with the dominated nations in uneven ways, and through direct ownership of industry in the dominated countries by foreign capitalists. So if you look at a place like Africa, where countries have won their formal independence, they are in an enormous amount of debt to the imperialist powers. Africa as a whole holds $1.8 trillion in debt, and the majority of it is owed either directly to imperialist powers or to financial institutions controlled by Western imperialism, like the World Bank and the IMF, which is essentially equivalent to owing that money to the US and other Western imperialists. And then a large chunk of it, again, is directly owed to other imperialist powers, in particular to China. And these loans have extremely high interest rates and put these countries under huge debt burdens. And the loans also come with strings attached. IMF loans notoriously come with what they call conditionality, which means that in order to receive these loans, the countries are required to cut funding for public services and enact austerity on the people living in those countries. Just one example, in 2022, the IMF gave Bangladesh a $4.5 billion loan, but the condition was that it would cut subsidies for fuel, fertilizer, and electricity. And basically every single IMF loan has similar conditions. And all of this, of course, has a huge impact on life in these countries, which are burdened with enormous debt and forced into economic subservience. 3.3 billion people in the world live in countries that pay more on interest repayments than on healthcare or on education. And Lenin described that in the era of imperialism, the division of the world by the main imperialist powers has been completed, meaning that there is no longer new territory to conquer. But he says that this does not mean that the division of the world is going to remain static. In fact, that now means that the division is quite fragile, because the inevitable drive for expansion that happens under capitalism can only be achieved now through the redivision of the world, which means battles between imperialist powers. And these battles can and do take all sorts of forms. There can be economic battles through things like competing investments, loans, trade agreements. There can be political battles through things like propping up politicians who might be more favorable to a particular imperialist power. And the tensions can also break out into all-out military conflict and war. And I think when a lot of people think about imperialism, they think about military conflict and war, and this is a very important characteristic of imperialism. Right now, there are dozens of wars and armed conflicts happening all around the world. There are 110 million people who are displaced due to armed conflict right now. But war is not something that is intrinsic to human society. And these endless wars that have been going on for decades are ultimately a result of imperialism and will continue to last as long as capitalism lasts. But ultimately, war is not the thing that defines imperialism. It's a concentrated expression of the economic relations and tensions between imperialist powers. These wars can be fought for a number of reasons. For example, they can be fought directly between imperialist powers for the redivision of the world, for access to markets and labor and resources. That was the case for parts of World War I and World War II. They can also be fought more indirectly through proxies and for the same reasons. They can also be fought for kind of broader strategic considerations, such as weakening one's enemy, which is the case in the war in Ukraine right now between the US and NATO and Russia, which had the goal of weakening Russia but that they're failing to achieve that goal right now, or for the goal of maintaining influence in a particular region, which is part of why the U.S. is continuing to back Israel to this day. And while imperialist war is at its root one form of the boiling over of tensions between the imperialist countries in their battles for spheres of influence, it is notable as a particularly brutal aspect of imperialism because it means that workers are thrown into these conflicts to be maimed, injured, killed by each other so that their capitalists can maintain or expand their profits. If you want to learn more about imperialist war, by the way, the International recently published a collection of Lenin's writings on this topic that is also available at the bookstore. Nowadays, the division of the world looks quite different than it did when Lenin wrote Imperialism, both through the replacement of direct colonial rule with the indirect economic domination, and also in terms of who the main imperialist powers are and their relative strengths. His analysis of imperialism as a phenomenon is still correct, but of course, as he himself predicted, these spheres of influence have shifted over the last century. At the end of World War II, the US emerged as the dominant imperialist superpower, balanced only by the Soviet Union. The colonial revolutions in the following decades represented a major shakeup in imperialist relations. The fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s and the recent emergence of Russia as a smaller imperialist power, and in particular after the return to capitalism in China and the rise of China as an imperialist power, all of those have been major factors in the shifts of spheres of influence that have happened over the last several decades. And at this stage, American imperialism, while still the dominant force in the world, is in relative decline, and you can see that across the world. In Latin America, which the US has historically had a complete stranglehold over, China's economic influence has grown very rapidly in the last couple of decades. In 2000, less than 2% of exports from Latin America went to China, but over the next 8 years, trade with China grew at an average of 31% per year, and by 2010, China and Latin America were trading $110 billion per year. By 2023, that number had reached $450 billion per year, and now China is actually the largest trading partner of South America and the second largest of Latin America as a whole after the US. The amount of loans and foreign investment in Latin America by China has also been on the rise, and you see similar processes happening in Africa and other parts of the world. And the relative decline of US imperialism is also seen in their response to Israel's escalation of the war in the Middle East. The US used to have many stable allies in this region, but now they really can only rely on Israel, and so they need to cling on to it with everything that they can. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that China is going to become the next world dominant superpower. It's facing its own internal crisis of capitalism, and we can't exactly say what the imperialist relationships are going to look like in the next 10, 20 years. But what we can say is that the increased imperialist tensions will come along with more war, with more instability as the imperialists battle it out all around the world. So by thoroughly studying Lenin's analysis of imperialism and what it looks like today, we can see that imperialism is an inevitable stage of capitalist development. It's arrived at by the internal logic of the system itself, and that the instability and poverty and war that come along with it are inevitable as well. They're not driven by poor policy choices or bad morals of capitalist politicians, and this is not a phenomenon that can be ended while capitalism as a system still stands. But this pressure that weighs on billions of people around the world because of life under capitalism has and will continue to result in a revolutionary fight against it. Across the world over the last few years, in country after country, we've seen mass movements in Sri Lanka, Kenya, Bangladesh, Chile, Sudan, Peru, Pakistan, just to name a few. And these mass movements have broken out due to the crisis of capitalism, the disintegration of living standards. And for those of us here in the US who hate imperialism and who want to see it ended, the question for us is, what can we do to end imperialism? What can we do to fight against that? And the first thing I think for us to recognize is that these movements are coming for us here in the US as well. The US, despite its economic dominance, cannot escape the crisis of capitalism, and the American working class will fight back against it. This was evidenced by the George Floyd movement in 2020 and by the Palestine Solidarity movement this year, and even larger struggles are on the horizon here in the US. So we need to build a communist party here in the US ahead of those movements that can eventually lead the working class to power in this country. And when the working class takes power here, it will be the decisive blow for world imperialism. A worker state in the US would not only fundamentally transform life for the working class here, but also for the international working class. We would immediately cancel all foreign debt and the unfair trade agreements that the US has. There would be no more US imperialist meddling through supporting counter-revolutionary governments, through orchestrating coups for their own imperialist interests. And a successful revolution here would also be a huge political motivation and inspiration to the international working class. Now, ultimately, in order to overthrow global capitalism, we will need a strong communist party in every country around the world. And that's why we're building not just the Revolutionary Communists of America, but the Revolutionary Communist International. We have comrades across the world who are in the same struggle as we are. And if we can build the RCA as a strong section of that international that leads struggles of the working class and that eventually leads the working class to power here, we will help to raise the banner and the authority of the RCI across the world, which will help to build strong communist parties in every country that will lead the international working class to power, end imperialism once and for all, and allow us to put our collective efforts towards building a socialist society.
The highest stage of capitalism inevitably produces war, but it also produces catastrophic and avoidable crises. Last week, I was informed by the manager of the ICU that I work in that the hospital had less than a week's supply of IV fluids. IV fluids are life-saving treatments for a myriad of treatable diseases. They are often the first line of treatment in life or death situations. But the shortage of IV fluids is not for a lack of supply. This market in the United States is supplied by 4 manufacturers. Hurricane Helene swept through North Carolina in late September, destroying Baxter International's North Cove facility, the site that produces 60% of the US's IV fluids. 97% of hospitals in the United States are locked into legally binding contracts with one of the 4 manufacturers that restrict them from purchasing their supplies elsewhere. This, of course, ensures that the capitalists are making the most amount of profit. So even when the sole facility of the nation's largest supply of IV fluids is destroyed, hospitals can't purchase supplies from any of the other 3 major manufacturers. Similar crises have unfolded in the last decade. In 2017, Hurricane Maria destroyed Baxter International's manufacturing facility in Puerto Rico. Baby formula and other medical supply shortages resulted from the COVID pandemic, and these disruptions have dire consequences. This system with profits and competition at its center will only produce more competition and allow for further domination of one manufacturer over the other, creating limited supplies that could easily be disrupted. This is what Trotsky means when he says monopolistic capitalism not only does not mitigate the anarchy of the market, but on the contrary, imparts to it a particularly convulsive character. The only solution for a permanent end to the problem is the destruction of the rotten capitalist system that puts profits over people and the building of a socialist society where the working class democratically plans the production to meet the needs of everyone.
I think the worst euphemism that I can think of is U.S. intervention. And I want to talk about what that means and how that's connected to the huge influx of Latin American immigrants that have come in the last half century or so. So starting with some examples, in Guatemala, before 1944, the country was ruled by a dictator, Ubico. And at this time, United Fruit, which is a U.S. company, now it's called Chiquita, it owned 42% of all land in Guatemala. One company, one U.S. company. And it didn't have to pay very much in taxes or import duties, so great deal. 77% of all Guatemalan exports went to the United States, and 65% of imports came from the United States. So it was basically a colony of the United States through one company, United Fruit. United Fruit also owned the country's telephone and telegraph system. It was nicknamed El Pulpo by actual Guatemalans because I mean, it means the octopus because it just owned everything, right? Until the 1944 Guatemalan Revolution, which kicked Ubico out and elected Arevalo, a liberal. And then in 1951, they elected Arbenz, a socialist, who brought communists into the government. His Decree 900 gave idle land that United Fruit wasn't even using, to farmers, which is really bad for United Fruit, who were using only 8% of the land that they owned. Arbenz seized 40% of that land, paid its market value, which, by the way, was deflated because of United Fruit's deals, right? So this is really bad for U.S. big business, which is fused with the U.S. state in the age of imperialism. Eisenhower was president at this time, and he did not want to directly intervene in Guatemala. And this is what intervening means. Instead, he had the CIA train mercenaries to sabotage Arbenz secretly, which, by the way, a democratically elected government thrown up by a revolution, and installed their own guy, Armas. And how it worked, the US sent 150 people to make Guatemalans believe that they're being invaded by a greater force and just scare them. So the U.S. bombed Guatemala City. Innocent people died in this. Broadcast propaganda messages on the radio, and they used spies to undermine Arbenz's authority with his own supporters. And all of this was in secret, even to Arbenz, who asked the U.S. for help. He resigned and fled Guatemala, and the CIA replaced him with their guy. Next example, El Salvador. In 1932, there were mass uprisings against the U.S.-friendly government. The U.S. sent arms to that government to fight back, and they killed 30,000 people. Aid continued under the 70s to this right-wing government and increased under Reagan in the 80s, despite these, symbolic checks by Congress where this horrible violence continued. And in the Civil War in El Salvador, 1979 to 92, this was a revolution against that U.S.-friendly regime to finally kick it out. The U.S. funded that right-wing government to fight back $1 or $2 million a day. It includes funding and training death squads to keep them in power. These people, they kidnapped, tortured, murdered left-wingers. They decapitated them with guillotines. And then they used meat-packing plants to dispose of the remains. This is why I say U.S. intervention is the worst euphemism. The tactic against these left-wingers was called draining the sea, another great euphemism, because, these people, this revolutionary forces, they had mass support. So fighting the revolutionaries meant fighting ordinary El Salvadorians. In this scorched earth policy, they raped, they pillaged, they massacred entire villages. One called El Mozote, explicitly including its children, these troops were told, kill all the children to serve as a bloody example to the rest. Over the whole of this war, Reagan spent about $1 billion in total, and that's a lot for this time, right, on military aid for the government just during the administration. 1 million people out of 6 million were displaced because their homes were destroyed. So where are they going to go, right? Lots of them went to the U.S. And as for how many people died, it's hard to say because this isn't recorded. This is secret, right? At least 70,000, probably more, right? So lots more. There are endless more examples of this. There's Nicaragua. I don't know, I have more listed here. And not even in Latin America, but all over the world. The Greek Civil War was crushed because of U.S. intervention. But what's the common thread here? What's the point? The U.S. imperialism creates the conditions that force immigrants to leave, to people to immigrate, right? Over and over, the U.S., they overthrow these revolutionary movements by funding right-wing regimes to crush them. And why do they do this? Because they have business interests. And what does that mean? It means access to raw materials at a good deal. It means cheap land. It means a good place to export both products and capital to make money on interest, right? And cheap labor to make products cheaply. And that's what we're talking about when we say sphere of influence. It's access to all these things. Just in quick facts and figures. In 1935, almost 100 years ago, half of all U.S. steel and cotton exports were sold in Latin America. Extremely good market, right? Because the U.S. markets couldn't absorb these things. And between just 1950 and 1965, U.S. corporations invested $3.8 billion in Latin America and made $11.2 billion in profits. And compare that to Europe, they actually lost money in Europe. Another one, 1991, Grenada had 118 offshore banks on its lands. That's 1 in 64 every Guatemalans. Every 64 Guatemalans gets a bank, right? I mean, not really for them. But all this is for laundering, tax evasion, fraud, increasing profits, right? So that's what it means that when that Latin America is America's backyard. And currently it's losing it, right? That's what it means. It means high stakes, extremely profitable investment that the imperialists are willing to defend with violence, with rape, with pillaging, because to not have them means being confined to the US and going under. You know, you can't have capitalism in one country. That's what imperialism is about, right? And so what do revolution in these countries mean? It means nationalization, expropriation from US business interests. It means losing their huge empire, right? It means Chiquita and Anaconda Copper, International Telephone and Telegraph, who gave $1 million to crush Allende in Chile directly, losing their billions in super profits. The point is, like, since 1965, half of all immigrants to America have been from Latin America. That's over 35 million people. Is it any wonder why these people leave when the U.S. imperialists are causing all this horrible violence? They're destroying their homes, right? It's capitalism that forces people to immigrate.
I wanted to talk about China and ask the question whether China is imperialist. Now, we can only answer this question if we understand what imperialism is and is not. I think in certain circles within what passes for the left, in particular in the United States, imperialism is defined in a very static way and reduced to a series of individual imperialist and then anti-imperialist countries. At the same time, it's even reduced to a question of culture or morality. This is a little bit like what Abit was talking about. For example, the idea that Americans just have an imperialist mindset or something like that. But this is ultimately the method of formal logic, which understands things only on their surface and as if they are unchanging, and this is incorrect. Now, Lenin explained that imperialism is a world system. It's a stage in world capitalism in which monopolies and finance capital dominate. Imperialism is not a question of this or that country, but an international question that can only be explained by understanding class. Every country is ultimately divided between workers and capitalists, and every national capitalist class will have imperialist ambitions at a certain stage, i.e. ambitions to conquer foreign markets economically and, when necessary, militarily. Every national capitalist class will want to increase its slice of the world economic pie. And Lenin also explained that, just like everything else, imperialism operates dialectically. It experiences change. Certain imperialist powers rise and then later fall. The current stage of imperialism today is not the same as it was when Lenin was writing. When he was writing, Britain was far and away the dominant world imperialist power, but then that was overtaken by the United States, which is itself in a period of decline right now. So if we understand this, if this is our theoretical backbone, then the question that we have to start with asking is China capitalist? And the answer to this is absolutely yes, 100%. Beginning in the 1980s, China begun the process of returning to capitalism, and this process has since been completed. China today has the second highest number of billionaires in the world, behind the United States, but above India. 135 Fortune 500 companies are Chinese. 219 multinational corporations are headquartered in China, the third most in the world. China joined the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s, i.e. the Imperialist Trade Commission that's headquartered in Switzerland. Now, if China is a capitalist country, then at a certain stage, inevitably, Chinese capitalists will acquire ambitions abroad. They'll want to export their capital and invest in foreign markets and then bring into their home country raw materials. And this is precisely what has happened. China invests abroad, such as in Africa and Latin America, in order to bring home raw materials. This is why it builds infrastructure, such as the famous Belt and Road Initiative, not for moral goodness or benefit, charity reasons, but in order to profit. All of the loans that it provides in order to build infrastructure have to be paid back with interest. It's precisely the same type of imperialism as the West. But because now there's a competitor to American imperialism, certain smaller countries are able to sort of play off of the two and maybe get a cheaper or better deal in any one situation. So 57 countries in the world now are in debt to China, totaling over $1 trillion. In Latin America, the backyard of U.S. imperialism, Brazil, China, and China has overtaken the U.S. as the biggest trading partner for Brazil, Chile, and Peru. In all of Latin America, China is the second largest creditor. Africa's annual debt repayments to China have increased fivefold over the past 10 years and are set to peak. This was from 2 years ago. They were set to peak in 2022. China is Africa's biggest bilateral lender. The debt was almost $90 billion as of 2022. Angola, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Zambia are the biggest holders in Africa of Chinese debt. And so this is precisely the explanation for the tension between the US and China that's going on right now. Chinese imperialism is competing with the interests of the United States, in particular in the South Pacific, but also in Africa. Now, we have to understand that at a certain stage, that Abadi explained this, military question is not the essential defining question of imperialism. This is something that arises at a certain stage. With economic interests, flow needs to use your military. And at a certain stage, economic dominance will take a military form. This is starting to happen. China now has a military base in Djibouti, and it's building other military bases across Asia. It has the second largest military in the world, and it's ultimately this military that's beginning to come in conflict with the US military in Southeast Asia. And we've seen recently all of these different war games drills over Taiwan. And so the central fact of today's world is the relative decline of US imperialism. But as the US imperialism declines, this doesn't mean that the world becomes better or that more progressive players enter the scene. It means that other imperialist powers start to compete with the US, and China is the biggest one of those. But others include Russia, and then even smaller regional imperialist powers that can gain more of their own pie as U.S. imperialism recedes. And this is why the world we're entering is one of increasing imperialist competition, and why we're entering an epoch of small wars and proxy wars. But of course, imperialist rivalry and wars are the handmaidens of revolution, and that's what we're preparing for. We're not supporting this or that imperialist power against the United States, but we're fighting all of world imperialism by preparing for revolution at home.
What the Bolsheviks achieved in 1917 was nothing short of extraordinary. Not only did they manage to overthrow capitalism, but they also proved, in practice, that workers are capable of holding onto power and running society by themselves. This revolution success story frightened the imperialist nations, particularly in the US. They didn't want the American workers getting any ideas from the Bolsheviks, after all. In fact, the Russian Revolution frightened the US ruling class so much so that they not only armed and financed the counter-revolutionary White Army in Russia, but they even went so far as to send US troops directly onto Russian soil to strangle the nascent worker state. Of course, the US wasn't the first to try and crush the gains made from the Russian Revolution. Winston Churchill, pretty early on, declared, "Bolshevism has to be strangled in its cradle," and multiple imperialist expeditions followed suit. So alongside the ongoing civil war against the White Armies, the workers of Russia also had to face the wrath of 21 military contingents invading from 16 different countries. The First World War had left Europe in shambles. However, the US was in a unique position. It emerged from the war as the world's largest creditor and an economic and military powerhouse. By January 1918, Woodrow Wilson declared his vision of a new world order, with US imperialism spearheading a world with peace and democracy, free from Bolshevism, of course. In fact, when American troops set foot on Russian soil, they were so delusional that they actually believed that they would be welcomed as some sort of saviors by the locals, and that these locals would then rise up against the Bolsheviks and overthrow them. Unfortunately, the imperialists tragicomically underestimated the strength of the Red Army and the determination of the Soviet masses, who were willing to go to any length to protect the gains of their revolution. In the months that followed, the American soldiers fought on multiple fronts and were therefore able to witness the cruelty of the counter-revolutionary White Armies and warlords firsthand. They grew sympathetic to the Reds. So when American troops showed signs of demoralization, the Reds responded not just by military means, but through political appeals on the basis of proletarian internationalism. It was also at this time that Lenin wrote his letter to American workers, in which he highlighted the class divisions that existed within the US, explained the class nature of the First World War, and emphasized that the American worker does not have an enemy in the workers of Russia, Germany, or even the workers of Britain. Instead, the main enemy is at home. Now, as political pressure in the US, back home, grew to end the Russian invasion, soldier morale continued to fall. Until one day, as all things do, it reached a tipping point. US troops, low on weapons, supplies, and men and morale, threatened a general mutiny against their officers. Within the year, the last US troops pulled out of Siberia and the battle was over. Lenin had proven in action the superiority in strength of workers' internationalism, a force so strong that it was capable of defeating US imperialism despite the threat of 21 foreign contingents. I'll leave you with Lenin's closing remarks in his letter to American workers, which has since then been used not just by Americans, but by workers across the globe. We know that before the world revolution breaks out, a number of separate revolutions may be defeated. In spite of this, we are firmly convinced that we are invincible because the spirit of mankind will not be broken by the imperialist slaughter. Slowly but surely, the workers are adopting communist Bolshevik tactics and are marching toward the proletarian revolution, which alone is capable of saving dying culture and dying mankind. In short, we are invincible because the world proletarian revolution is invincible.
Marxism stands with its scientific method, the science that Marxist theory is based on the idea of class independence of the working class, right? We always say that the working class has to organize as a class. As a class, it has its own separate interests that are different from and opposed to the interests of the bourgeoisie and other layers in society. Now, that's true if we're talking about the election in the United States. That is why we don't support the Democrats over the Republicans or the Republicans over the Democrats. We say the working class needs to have its own candidates that represent its class interests. So just like we have that view when we look at the elections in the United States or any other country, we also have that view in terms of world politics, in terms of the question of imperialism. And you know, this question of the rise of the imperialist blocs, which I agree, I thought B brought up a very good point, that we've had a change in the world, in the international relations, so to speak, since the 1990s with this rise of what they call multipolarity. What you're really talking about is the rise of an imperialist bloc that's competing with the US. Now, the first thing we have to understand is this is not unprecedented. In fact, when Lenin was describing imperialism, when he was explaining imperialism in his book, right, which he wrote during the First World War, the first imperialist war, what he was describing was a world where the imperialist powers had broken into two blocks. In World War I, one of the blocks was called the Allied Powers. That included France, Britain, the Russian Tsar, the Russian Empire, and eventually the United States. Those were the Allied powers. And they were fighting the Central Powers, which included Germany, Austria-Hungary, which was an empire at that time, and the Ottoman Empire, which was based in Turkey at that time. You had these two imperialist blocs, and Lenin explained that neither imperialist bloc was better than the other. There wasn't one progressive or pro-worker imperialist bloc versus the anti-worker imperialist bloc. Neither one was progressive. They were both reactionary, right? And Lenin said, right, the strategy was, we're opposed to both imperialist blocs, a pox on both of your houses, right? But the main enemy is at home. And that's what has to guide us, right? Now, after World War I, the same thing happened again. In World War II, it was a little bit more complex. But in World War II, you had two imperialist blocs basically formed. One was Britain and France, later joined by the United States, versus the Axis powers, German imperialism, Japanese imperialism, Italian imperialism. Again, neither bloc was progressive. And this is important, right? Because Stalinists and reformists have tried to create this idea that somehow the Allied forces, they were anti-Nazi, anti-fascist, they were more progressive. That's just not true, comrades. Absolutely not true. The World War II was an inter-imperialist war, with the exception of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. That of course, we defended the Soviet Union, and by the way, the Soviet Union ended up winning that war. But the Allied imperialist bloc was no more progressive in any way, shape, or form than the Nazi bloc. By the way, as soon as the war was over, right, a lot of Nazis got jobs either in Germany, in Austria, or even shipped to the United States. Anyone know who headed NASA? Werner von Braun, the guy who developed the V1 and the V2, the vengeance weapons for Hitler. This guy ends up working at the top of NASA. So that was his punishment. The U.S. imperialism in no way, shape, or form was against fascism or Nazism. It was against German imperialism because there was a conflict of interest. Now, after World War II, you had a unique situation. Stalinism came out of the war, greatly strengthened. So you had U.S. imperialism on one side, and they took all the smaller imperialist countries, put them under their wings, right? And it was a bipolar world in the sense it was U.S. imperialism versus the Soviet Union, versus the expanded Stalinism, and versus the colonial revolution, which was rising at that time. So in those days, during that period from 1945 until the late, let's say, 1980s, we as communists, we could critically support the national liberation struggles. We can critically support Stalinism against imperialism. But then we saw in the late 80s and the early 90s, the collapse of Stalinism, right? And that's worth a whole different discussion. But Stalinism basically collapsed because of the contradictions that arose in Stalinism. And that led to this new world order, so to speak, where the U.S. once again became the largest, most powerful imperialist country in the world. Now, it still is that. It is still the most powerful imperialist country. But as B explained, its relative power is in decline. Now, why do we say, I want to give a scientific base, why do we say that one imperialist bloc is not more progressive than another bloc? Because as Marxists, what do we examine as the main contradiction, the main fetter on what's going on today in terms of the development of human society? We explain that the two main fetters that are blocking the development of human society is private ownership of the means of production and the nation state. How can any imperialist country rectify those two things? It can't. It can't. Neither imperialist bloc can eradicate those two main fetters. The only thing that can eradicate those fetters is the working class, organized as a class, taking power first in one country, then in another country, then in another country, taking these worker states, unifying them as a socialist federation, and then establishing a nationalized planned economy so that we can eradicate the nation state and we can eradicate private ownership of the means of production. But there is no imperialist bloc that is moving in that direction. Russia is not moving in that direction. China, capitalist China, is not moving in that direction. Certainly the United States is not moving in that direction. And that's why we would reaffirm that neither bloc is progressive. A pox on both of your houses, so to speak. But the main enemy is at home, which of course we're here in the strongest, most powerful imperialist country, US imperialism. So our task is to build a party now that helps the working class to become conscious of itself as a class, becomes conscious of its interests, its class interests, and that eventually is able to fight for power and overthrow US imperialism, overthrow the US capitalist class, and establish a worker state in the United States, which, when that happens, it will free the world and we will be on the road to socialism.
BlackRock and State Street, among other asset managers, attempt to avoid criticisms by claiming that they themselves are publicly owned. In reality, the public owners of these fund managers are themselves institutional investors. To take BlackRock as an example, nearly 62% of its shares are held by institutions. Vanguard holds 9%, State Street holds 4%, its own executives own 3%. Merrill Lynch's investment management business, which held a massive 44% of BlackRock shares, was bought out by BlackRock in 2006. And most ironically, BlackRock owns 7% of its own stock. In fact, at least as of January 2023, there were only 215 shareholders in BlackRock in total. Now, the exact statistics of other publicly owned asset managers may look different, but the overall relationship is the same. These are groups with the same exact economic interests, and they own at least a controlling interest in these groups, in these asset managers. And what do I mean by a controlling interest? Here I can ask Lenin for some help from Imperialism. Quote, as a matter of fact, experience shows that it is sufficient to own 40% of the shares of a company in order to direct its affairs, since in practice, a certain number of small scattered shareholders find it impossible to attend general meetings, etc. The democratization of the ownership of shares, from which the bourgeois sophists and opportunist so-called social democrats expect the democratization of capital, the strengthening of the role and significance of small-scale production, etc., is in fact one of the ways of increasing the power of the financial oligarchy. End quote. So, in the modern day, with increases in this, quote, democratization of stock ownership through fractional shares and retail investors like Robinhood, this number is now not 40%, it's closer to 30%. You only need 30% ownership of the shares in the company to effectively control that company. So when we say that these asset managers control the economy, we mean it literally. After all, they own roughly 30% at least of the publicly traded Fortune 100 companies. And when you look at the managers themselves, you see that they own at least 30% of each other. And these institutions, whose capital primarily comes from 401ks, pension and retirement funds of workers, do not represent workers. They represent their shareholders. BlackRock has been found to vote against greater environmental regulations in companies it invests in when it determines that those regulations will hurt profits more than the climate change the regulations aim to combat will hurt profits. And I assure you, the workers would not agree with this assessment if they were actually in charge. So to wrap up, what we need is to replace this democratic ownership of financial capital with truly democratic ownership of the entirety of the means of production. And we need to expropriate these massive funds to put them to use for the betterment of the workers of the world.
We're communists in the single most reactionary imperialist power in the history of the world of capitalism. When we talk about the main enemies at home, we need to be very clear as to who we're directing our forces against. And, you know, the same asset management companies that own all the main monopolies, that have those imperialist interests abroad, are the same asset management companies, you know, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard Group, all of these, that own the media in this country. And we're always constantly subjected to a huge amount of state-sponsored, capitalist-sponsored propaganda for that they're trying to influence us, the working class of this country, to support our own bourgeoisie against the working class of the world. In the current conflict between Israel and Iran and Gaza, of course, Lebanon, etc., they're basically saying, I mean, Israel has been provoking Iran for months now, bombing and assassinating its leaders, and now the ruling class is saying, well, that basically Iran should show restraint. They paint Iran as the aggressor against Israel, which is very, very far from the truth, as we know. But the way I saw the New York Times had this, they do it constantly, by the way, but just a small example, the New York Times had one of their sort of like daily briefings via email, like email summaries of like the most important news of the day, that was titled An Axis Against Democracy. The axis of evil is Russia, China, Iran, North Korea are autocratic regimes, anti-democratic, and they're the axis of evil of the world. They talk about these authoritarian countries seek to weaken the U.S.-led alliance of democratic countries, right? So the other side of it is democracy, right? They say that they have clear ideological similarities, even though there's difference between, Russia, China, whatever. All are autocracies that represent dissent through imprisonment and death. The implication, again, is that U.S. is some kind of peaceful force, whereas we see, from Erica's intervention and others, again, it's been the single most violent power in the history of capitalism. They also say, by the way, look at how they use identity politics, that North Korea, China, whatever, to varying degrees are hostile to political equality. Few women hold senior government roles. LGBTQ citizens are also repressed, which, again, the implication is that there's no women's oppression or LGBTQ oppression in the so-called democratic countries. But you can see, what is it like? You can have the call for like liberalizing the armed forces, and you can now have like LGBTQ people and more women in the U.S. Army. Or you can have, a woman president or a man president of the United States bombing children and massacring people around the world. That's supposedly more progressive, right? That's the implication of that. But here's the rub, right? They say that why are these the axis of evil? The country's common goal is to weaken the U.S. and its allies. Doing so could reduce the appeal of democracy. So they say that these countries share an antipathy for the liberal aspects of the U.S.-led order for U.S. democracy. This is absolute rubbish. I think our main duty here in the U.S. is to fight this hypocrisy tooth and nail, to point out the real history of the U.S. Imperialism. But we also shouldn't, of course, fall into the trap of saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And because the U.S. media is attacking China, therefore China is a progressive power. I think, again, comrades have talked about this. We always base ourselves on the power of the world working class against world imperialism, world capitalism as a whole. But I think the lines for us are very clear. The main enemy is at home, and we need to fight U.S. imperialism as our primary enemy and fight for revolution here in the United States.
I really appreciated Kelly's description of monopoly in the IV fluids. And I think that's an excellent example of how this just permeates into every aspect of life under capitalism. Imperialism does, and also touches on the points that Nico was making about, does the U.S. Working class benefit from imperialism? We see the impacts of the monopoly stage of capitalism right here at home in crises like what Kelly was describing. There's a lot of discussion about the relative decline of U.S. imperialism and the increasing instability that has kind of come along with that. And of course, in the fact that for us, we see all imperialisms as enemies of the international working class, which I think is something that is an incredibly important thing for us to keep in mind. And as Abit was talking about, the dividing line is not between workers and people in the West and in imperialist countries. It's not between Europeans and the rest of the world, or white people and the rest of the world. It's a class divide. It's a divide between the international working class and the capitalist class internationally, and that is where that struggle needs to take place in order to liberate the international working class. I think, I wanted to also talk about, kind of highlight Julian's intervention on the already existing socialization of production that exists at this stage of capitalism. And I think that is an incredibly inspiring and exciting thing for us to kind of think about, that capitalism has laid the basis for socialism. There's all of this concentration that we've described, that Dakota described, this whole web of finance capital that is controlled by a very small number of people, and a small number of financial institutions. The amount of data that they have on the functioning of the capitalist economy, and the ability to produce an enormous amount of goods that should be used, that could be used to benefit the lives of the majority of everyone in the world, but because of the private ownership of the means of production is instead produced on the basis of profit, and there's an enormous amount of waste that is thrown away. All of that could very easily be expropriated, nationalized, and planned by the working class in order to actually produce enough for everyone. And that, I think, is an incredibly exciting future to look forward to. And a lot of comrades talked about what we need to do in order to actually see that happen. And I want to reiterate what Laura was saying. The ruling class in the U.S. constantly talks about American interests. If you watch like the debate, for example, Trump and Kamala are constantly talking about what is best for Americans. What is the best thing for American interests? And I think that we need to be very clear that there's no such thing as just American interest in the abstract. It's the interest of the American ruling class, the international capitalist class, and the American working class and the international capitalist class. There's no national national interests for the working class. There are class interests. And in order to carry out those class interests, we need to organize on an international basis. We need to build a revolutionary communist international, which is exactly what we were building in order to overthrow capitalism, imperialism in our lifetime and see the construction of socialism in our lifetime.